Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans of Football. My name is Mehreen Khan.
And I'm Simon Cooper. This is the football show where we take the hero and we show you the human.
From Johan Cruyff to Megan Rapinoe.
And from George Best to Kylian Mbappe.
This is the Human Football Podcast.
Last week's episode was about the Brazilian Ronaldo, R9, and the mystery of the 1998 World Cup final. Why was he there, on the field, but not really there? What happened? If you haven't already, please be sure to check it out.
Hello and welcome back to Heroes and Humans for our first Christmas special, Simon.
And it is about a Christmas event. We're talking about a legendary event that actually did happen, which is the Christmas Truce of 1914 in World War I, when German and British soldiers come out of the trenches, meet in no man's land, and play football matches together. Now that day, World War I on the Western Front temporarily stopped, which conjures this vision, what if it had stopped for good at Christmas 1914? These football matches, and it's matches plural, they're not a myth, as many people think. It seems too good to be true, but it actually happened. These matches were described in letters home, in diaries, regimental histories and private memoirs. Stuff was published about it in British newspapers a few days into 1915. And a couple of the balls used that day are now in museums. And we're telling the story of the Christmas Truce matches, partly because the story is bizarre and beautiful, but we're also going to use it to cast light on our present day era of wars.
Simon, is there a marriage of topics, World War I and football, that could be even more up your street? I can't imagine that you...
I did a book that was largely about World War II and football, so that is also a particular obsession.
But you're very excited for this Christmas special. I grew up in the UK. I, like most kids, went through British schooling. My history curriculum was only about World War I and World War II, of course, so I did know about the Christmas Truce. I then went on to do a history degree, where I mercifully avoided this period because I'd been overexposed to it as a young kid. But we are also going to try and throw some of the lessons from the Christmas Truce forward. What does the Christmas Truce tell us about war in our current times, or conflicts in our current times? Why can we not imagine the two sides of conflicts in places like Gaza and Israel, Sudan or Ukraine having a kickabout together? Is it about the changing nature of conflict and warfare, and also the changing nature of recreational activity, or things that we see as fun? So before we get to the Christmas Truce itself, Simon, do a bit of scene setting for us. We mentioned 1914. What's going on?
Well, that August, a lot of people are very excited that it's war. And so you see people cheering. There's enormous numbers of young men in the main countries who sign up spontaneously. I mean, in Britain, there's not a draft originally. It's just all volunteers. There hadn't been a serious war in Europe for about a century since Napoleon. Mostly it had been a very peaceable century. So you had these armies, but in Western Europe, nobody really had experience of war, and they thought it was quite chivalric. It was where men were men, and you kind of jousted and you proved your valor. They hadn't realized it was machine guns now. And so people are pretty up for it, and they see the other side as the devil. And so there's this idea that war is a manly game. In fact, it's a little bit like a football match. And of course, in Britain, this is very pronounced because British public school ideology held that sports sort of breeds the manliness and team spirit that you need for the greater game of war. And this is one reason why boys were made to play games at public schools all the time, also to make sure they were never alone so they could never indulge in the sin of masturbation. The muscular Christianity of the Victorians hugely valorised it. I'm not sure that the Duke of Wellington ever really said the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton.
Was that a apocryphal quote?
It might be apocryphal, but it was a kind of genuinely believed trope among the dimmer members of the ruling class.
That sport is just a training for real battle.
Yeah, and that battle is also a kind of sport.
Yeah.
But then things change very quickly. In the first 4 months of the war from that August, there's this terrible slaughter. There are machine guns now, there are shells, and almost all the troops at the front realise war is not really a fought match. The first Battle of Ypres in autumn 1914 leaves about 250,000 men dead or injured. There's some people who are still at this point really into war, but only the nutters. So there's this Austrian field messenger called Adolf Hitler, and at Ypres wins the Iron Cross second class. He had been proposed for the first class, but he didn't get the first class because just by chance his name was at the bottom of the list submitted by his regiment.
Do we think if you got the first class, you'd be
History
less of
might
an
have been
uppity
different.
little...
There are various points in today's episode where you see how history might have been different. By Christmas 1914, nearly 1 million Europeans are already dead. And the armies have settled into their trenches, mostly in northern and eastern France. So on this western front, the opposing trenches are very close, sometimes barely 50 metres apart. And so you can imagine if you're 50 metres away from the other side every day, you start to recognise them. So they're familiar faces.
You hear their voices. You
Yeah.
pick up their language.
Yes.
Their codes.
And there were also moments where it was sort of agreed that you didn't really shoot, like if they were hanging up washing and things. They were also picking up their codes, yeah. So at one point, a British sergeant receives a promotion. He's somewhere on the front line. And the Germans in the trench opposite raised this sign in English saying, in caps, "Congratulations, Mr. Harvey Lothar," because they'd cracked the British signals.
Lothar sounds like they've Germanicized his name as well.
No, I think it was correctly spelled.
Oh, okay.
And also, as we'll come to, many of the Germans in World War I had actually lived in Britain as guest workers before the war.
So we're at Christmas. Tell us about how eventually the truce will unfold.
Well, in telling this story, we're relying on 3 histories in particular. Very good books. The Christmas Truce by Malcolm Brown and Shirley Seaton. Der kleine Frieden im großen Krieg by the German journalist Michael Jürgs. And Silent Night, the remarkable 1914 Christmas Truce by the late American historian Stanley Weintraub. So what happens if you put all the accounts together is that the Christmas Truce, begins spontaneously, and it always starts from below. It's initiated by soldiers in the trenches. And by late Christmas Day, there's a truce on about 2/3 of the British sector of the front, where the Brits are facing the Germans. There are some French and Belgian regiments who also have a truce, but the French were much more anti-German because that country had been invaded, and this was also the second war with Germany in 40 years. So the British who went to the front were not particularly bothered about Germans. It's quite a positive view of Germans. Orwell said that British troops came back from every war very impressed with the Germans and unimpressed by everyone else. So there was a sort of a bit of a sense of kinship, and the other side are not the bad guys.
And a truce is a very, very temporary short cessation of hostilities.
It can be longer, but it's a kind of, I suppose it's an informal peace. So you haven't signed a peace treaty or any kind of suspension of conflict, but you just agree to it.
Organically, this happens.
On the Western Front, it's organic. There's no formal agreements. So what happens, the way it unfolds is on Christmas Eve, the Germans had these fir trees that they'd put in their trenches and they decorated them with Christmas lights. So they begin singing carols, the Germans, and the favourite German carol, Stille Nacht, Silent Night. And I think the British tune of Silent Night is from the original German. And at a place called La Chapelle d'Armentières, a British regiment shouts for more. Like, this is brilliant, Germans.
Encore.
Encore. And so the Germans sing O Tannenbaum, which is like O Fir Tree. So everyone's getting quite matey, and I think there's some Christmas grog being drunk in the separate trenches. And then the Germans in different spots would raise sheets with text scrawled on them in kind of pidgin English, like, you know shoot, we know shoot. And then you'd see this German head pop up above the parapet, not a safe thing in World War I. And the Brits would be like, okay, let's meet. Mm-hmm. And so Germans would then suddenly be walking amidst the corpses that littered no man's land in this horrendous landscape. And British soldiers would come out of the trenches to meet them on Christmas Day. And so these guys would be talking in no man's land, and some of the Germans would be speaking in English accents, or kind of almost English accents. And they'd say, yeah, I used to be a waiter, or I was a barber, or a taxi driver in London or in Manchester, because Britain in 1914 was a significantly richer country than Germany, so a lot of Germans would come out there. And there's a story of one Londoner who runs into his old barber who used to cut his hair at High Holborn.
That's mad.
And the German says, oh, sit down, I'll give you a haircut.
No.
Yeah.
Gets a trim. No man's land.
Yeah,
the first.
free. And another German comes up to British soldiers and speaking 1914 era Cockney says, watch a cock, how's London?
Wow.
Enemies shake hands, they wish each other Merry Christmas, they say, obviously we're not going to shoot today. Then people start chasing hares together, they eat dinner, they sing together. They swap clothes, they swap German beer for British plum pudding. People say, yeah, we'll definitely all get together and have some beers after the war. And people start to talk. Why are we shooting each other? Why are we here? Which is a very existential moment.
And a dangerous question to ask.
Yes, but a good question. And there are some photographs that the soldiers took that Christmas. These were also sent to British newspapers. So one or two appeared in British newspapers, and there's a famous one that was published in several papers on January the 8th, 1915. And it shows Germans and Britons huddled together in no man's land. Moustaches, thick coats, scarves, they're smoking German cigars, all of them, being shared around, and some clothes swapping going on.
And at this point, this is still an exclusively British-German affair. It's not clear whether the other allies, including the French, are joining in.
There's a little bit, but not very much, between the French and the Belgians and the Germans, yeah. But their feelings are stronger. So the British and Germans talk for hours. They bury the dead in communal services. I mean, that's beautiful. They show each other photographs of beautiful women back home. British soldiers put on German helmets. The Germans sing, I mean, this just gets weirder and weirder. This is all documented, right? This is all what people wrote at the time in diaries, letters home, letters to newspapers. The Germans sing God Save the King. Of course, you know, the royal family in Britain, famously, the Germans, as Private Eye calls them. And of course, what they're going to talk about, football.
Yeah, I mean, if there's enough blokes together in one place, they're going to talk about football.
And so there's this Saxon soldier who says, yeah, I used to be a waiter on the Fulham Road in London. Can you tell me how Fulham are getting on in the FA Cup? Lance Corporal Hines of the Westminsters met a German who said, good morning, sir. I live at Alexander Road, Hornsey, and I would see Woolwich Arsenal play Tottenham tomorrow.
Oh, you missed the game.
And so that's what happens on Christmas Day 1914. People produce footballs and spontaneous matches break out all along the British-German sector of the front. I think that football was already widespread enough, certainly in Britain, that it was sort of part of recreation for the troops. They were issued with footballs.
And it's a working class men sport. They're not playing rugby, are they? Or cricket?
Well, the officers are rugby players.
And at this point, do we know if officers are taking part, or this is still happening among them?
Well, this will become an issue because the officers are there to make sure that the war is fought. And I think some are very sympathetic to the truce, but others not so much. Now, Stanley Weintraub's book, which is really wonderful, has a lot of very good detail on the actual football matches. And he draws on letters home written by British and German soldiers who recount in a kind of wonder what they'd experienced. So there's this guy, Johannes Niemann, who's a Saxon lieutenant, dug in just south of Ypres. And he wrote, that was such a thing, das war so ein Ding. A Scot carried up a football which seemed to come from nowhere. An actual football match developed with thrown down caps for goals. The game finished 3-2 for Fritz. During the game, our lancers quickly discovered that the Scots did not wear underwear beneath their kilts.
Even going commando in December in Belgium is such a strong look.
And then after the match, they had a team photo, the Saxons and the Scots. And Niemann wrote, the players of both teams gathered in a group, always beautiful coloured rows, the football in the middle. Now, this would be the best team photograph in the history of football, but it had disappeared or it is lying in an attic somewhere.
Oh, so it's never been discovered still?
That photo is not. There's this photo in the papers. So they're not playing football. It's they're posing together with their cigars. So because there were no photographic records, I think there's no photograph of any of these football matches. For decades, there were doubts about whether the matches really happened. And even some World War I veterans in the decades after said, no, it's just a myth. They didn't play in no man's land. And Jeff Dyer's book, The Missing of the Somme in 1994, says it's doubtful that a Christmas match was played.
Right.
Which is wrong, because multiple were. Because there were similar accounts to the one written by Niemann in British newspapers after that Christmas, in the fortnight after. If you put together these various accounts, it's clear that for troops by Christmas 1914, football is the opposite of war. War is not a kind of footer match. No, it's the opposite. And when they chat about the war disappearing in a burst of brotherhood, it's like, yeah, then we'll all just play. And so to perverse a 1960s slogan, what they're saying is make football, not war.
Right. And the confusion here is whether there was one match, a match, but actually there were multiple matches.
Yeah.
And because we don't have a picture of the kickabout itself,
any of the kickabouts,
there has always been this sense in which maybe this was all just a kind of fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine there were not many cameras lying around on the Western Front, so yeah. But it's documented in writing.
How do the the guys who took part, how do they actually describe what it is? So we're calling it a match, but in any sense, is it just is it actually just a kickabout?
It's much more a kickabout. I mean, the conditions in no man's land, littered with corpses and shell holes and puddles, are impossible. So players fell in the mud, they'd be pulled out by the enemy, the spectators would cheer whenever anyone fell over, the spectators would be sitting on the parapets of the trenches. The soldiers are wearing these enormous boots, so close control is impossible. And people would also fall into shell holes. Michel Jurgs, in his history, he says goalposts were either a couple of pieces of wood or caps or helmets or even stretchers. And also they're knackered. I mean, they're not sleeping. They're wearing this very heavy kit. World War I is pretty tiring. So in one game, the participants are all knackered after an hour and they have to stop. But it's huge fun. So there's this testimony by a guy called Ernie Williams. In 1914, he was a soldier in the 6th Cheshire Regiment, and he told the BBC TV programme Grandstand in 1983. He said, "It was just a general kickabout. I should think there were a couple of hundred taking part. I was pretty good then at 19. There was no sort of ill will between us. There was no referee, no score, no tally at all. It was simply a melee, nothing like the soccer you see on television. The boots we wore were a menace, those great big boots, and in those days the balls were made of leather and they soon got very soggy." Now you might say, okay, this is an old bloke fantasizing 69 years later, having read mythical reports. But in fact, in January 1915, a sergeant called Nadin in Williams's battalion had described exactly that game in a letter to a Cheshire newspaper. So I guess the troops were regularly writing letters to newspapers, which as long as they didn't, contain sensitive information, these were then published. And so this stuff is being published back home.
And there's also other kinds of sport that are happening because, blokes.
Yeah, well, some kinds of sport that I think now would sort of even go beyond ultimate fighting. Scots and Prussians hold a boxing tournament somewhere on the front line. And in another sector, this British soldier from Stratford writes home, something even weirder happens. This guy wrote, "A German called over to our trenches that he was willing to fight single-handed any man we cared to send except an Irishman. His challenge was accepted by a Gordon Highlander, and the two met in front of the trenches for a good set-to with the bayonet. The German was killed after a hard fight."
Oh, so he just wanted a duel?
Yeah, I guess it's a duel, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Street fighter. He got knocked out, I guess.
Yeah, I think, but that's pretty hardcore even for a UFC fan.
Yeah, I think
like
we'd be
yourself,
stretching to call that sport as well.
There's another Christmas Truce match, not the same game that Johannes Niemann described, where the story only came out in 1999. This German called Rudolf Zenisch found his father's diary in the attic room in this Saxon village. Now, Rudolf's father had been Kurt Zenisch, who'd been a German lieutenant in World War I and had then fought in World War II in the Soviet Union, where he disappeared, never found again. So imagine that. This bloke has had to fight 2 world wars in one lifetime. And in the attic was his diary of World War I. And Kurt Zemisch's diary records a typical story of Christmas 1914. He wrote, "A couple of Britons brought a ball along from their trenches, and a lively game began. How fantastically wonderful and strange. The English officers experienced it like that too. But thanks to football and Christmas, the feast of love, deadly enemies, briefly came together as friends." The Saxons won that one 3-2 as well. Actually, it was always Germany winning.
Any pens? So we know that some newspapers were getting correspondence from troops in the trenches, and it's happening on both sides, on the British side and the German side. And even at that point, it's not being universally lauded as this great, honourable event. It's a bit of a scandal for some.
For some, yes, even some people at the front. So Adolf Hitler is at the front at Christmas 1914. And he spent Christmas Day in the cellar of an abbey near Ypres. And there he's told that men of his regiment had shaken hands with the British and played football with them. And Hitler is outraged. He says, "Something like that should not happen in wartime. Have you no German honour?" And indeed, regimental histories, German regimental histories written during the Nazi era, don't mention the Christmas Truce because it's considered deeply shameful.
So Hitler hates football, which is another one of his many crimes.
Yeah, so the only football match he ever saw was at the Berlin Olympics 1936. Germany lose to Norway, so he's not impressed. But no, he was boxing, I think motor racing he liked. So in most places, the superior officers on both sides intervene and they stop the truce within days. You're here to fight. And there's this insane British brigadier called C.M. Richards, who in a post-war memoir writes that he was happy when, quote, the good old sniping started again, just to make sure that the war was still on.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a headfuck, right?
It's hard to find a good excuse for his behaviour. So this bloke Richards had received a signal from battalion headquarters on Christmas Day. He writes in his memoir, quote, telling me to make a football pitch in no man's land by filling up shell holes, etc., and to challenge the enemy to a football match on the 1st of January. I was furious and took no action at all. I wish I had kept that signal. Stupidly, I destroyed it. I was so angry. It would have been a good souvenir. And there's this similar-minded bloke, the English captain Bryden McNeill. Any relatives should get in touch and complain about the pronunciation of his name. Bryden McNeill noted in his diary on January 14th, 1915, that his own troops happily hadn't gone in for any of that nonsense. He said when the Germans began walking out of their trenches towards them at Christmas, McNeill's men had simply fired. And he wrote, that quickly ended all the scratch my back and I'll scratch yours nonsense.
So, I mean, this is a legitimate fear that you don't want the level of enmity or perceived enmity to kind of wash away once you play the football match, because it's going to make these guys less willing to, one, risk their own lives and to kill the enemy.
Yeah, although with hindsight, somebody from 2024 might say, you know what, blokes, it would have been quite good had you given up the whole stupid thing at that point.
Oh, definitely. But this is just through the eyes of the contemporary
generals. You want to keep your men motivated. Yeah. It would be a bit like a Man U Liverpool game where people started giving each other back rubs. Yeah.
Or when, sometimes even at halftime, the players start exchanging shirts. And I'm like, what are you doing? Not yet.
I'm not sure we can stretch the parallel all the way, but I see it. But in some sectors where the officers are more forgiving, the truce lasts into the new year. In some places, even into February 1915.
So they're not fighting for 2 months?
I think what's really happening is a war strike. Many of the soldiers by this point have gone off the war. What are we doing here? We're all going to get ourselves killed. Many of our mates have been killed. Let's just try and sit this out. And so it's a kind of quiet strike. Or they call it now quiet quitting.
Quiet quitting. And I guess there was this false hope, I guess, that it will all be over by Christmas. And these guys know clearly by the beginning of 1915 that it's not going to be over, so that will only kind of make them more.
Yeah, that had been the slogan at the beginning of the war, we'll be home by Christmas, yeah. And we know that in the end they get back a very few of them. Of these blokes who are at the front in Christmas 1914, a very few will be home for Christmas 1918.
And then what happens on Christmas 1915? Do we get a repeat?
Well, there was great worry among the higher-ups that there would be a repeat. So orders went out to the men in the trenches, do not repeat the nonsense of 1914. And there is one point where it does happen. At Loos, Germans and Britons start playing football on Christmas 1915. And British officers reportedly threatened their own soldiers with machine guns. So then the match is abandoned. There is a man called Bertie Felstead, a British soldier who spent Christmas Day 1915 in a trench in northern France. And decades later, he recalled that he did play against the Germans that second wartime Christmas in the snow. But he said after half an hour, an officer came up to tell his men that they were in France to fight the Huns and not become their friends. Now, Felstead died in an old age home in Gloucestershire in 2001, aged 106. So he was the last known witness to Christmas football.
And therefore we can say that by 1915, even though there were far fewer matches, after this, it stops. It's over.
It doesn't seem to have happened again after that, no.
Okay. So the war carries on for another 3 years, but we do get no more sporting truces.
Yeah, I mean, the higher-ups are alert that this can happen, and they definitely don't want it to happen because, as you say, once men stop shooting each other, who knows what madness will come next.
So you mentioned that in the Nazi Germany period, the truce is seen as a shameful event. I think the Germans have a much more complicated relationship with the Christmas truce in that interwar period. And that primarily is, this sort of odd historiography about when you celebrate these things and when you don't. And it is in the period after the Treaty of Versailles, where Germany is seen to be humiliated in its peace arrangements with the Allies, that talking about the fact that there was this moment where our troops were playing nice with the enemy was something that should never have happened. And that's also where some of the denialism comes in. So then you say, parts of German media say, okay, it never happened at all. It's just a myth. It was just spread to make us look weak in front of the enemy. But ultimately, we would never engage in such a thing. I think actually, ironically, the Brits have it's less of a sensitive issue in our reading of the war, probably because we won.
Yeah, and in Germany there was this feeling that they could have won the war and there was some kind of stab in the back, or maybe we somehow let it slip at the front. So any kind of sense of weakness is much more scary if you're the loser.
Yeah, it got seized upon. So we mentioned that probably after 1915, no more football matches. But then football back home also stops.
Yeah, well, it had gone on for a while after war broke out, because in August 1914, when war was declared, the Football Association says, look, we're willing to abandon professional football. We'll put all the grounds at the disposal of the nation. And the War Office says, no, guys, don't worry, just play. It's fine. So the clubs happily played on for a while. But a lot of British people were outraged by this. They thought young men should be dying in France, for the national glory, and you shouldn't be playing football. Also because it was a working class game, and there was this feeling that the working classes were not sufficiently patriotic, that they didn't understand, that Britain's honour went above everything else, and the working classes were worried about issues like pay and stuff. So the middle and upper classes used football to chastise the bad working classes. Some newspapers refused to publish match reports, and on September 8th, 1914, your very own newspaper, The Times, publishes a letter from the temperance leader N.F. Charrington to the king. I don't know why he publishes letters to the king in the Times, but anyway.
King's paper, mate. Paper record.
I guess. And Charrington writes to the king that football continuing during the fighting is a disgrace. Later that season, Charrington, somewhat ambitiously, goes to Craven Cottage, the Fulham ground, to make a speech on military recruitment at half-time, urging people to join the army. But when he stands up to speak, two Fulham officials pop up and drag him away, even though he had permission to speak. So Charrington was not a big hero in the football fraternity.
But it's funny that's happening in September 1914, where you could still be living under the delusion that this war's just not going to be a serious event.
Yeah, but he thinks you should still go and fight for Britain's glory, and, you should not be shirking. I mean, you also had these women going around handing white flowers to young men who weren't in uniform, trying to shame them to go to the front. So you have these Puritans hassling football until 1916, and that's when the FA does finally curtail the professional game and they start to conscript.
So we're getting less men's football, but weirdly enough, the people who benefit from this are women.
Yeah, so you're having this kind of gender revolution in World War I. Of course, the men are away, so they need women to work in factories. So it's no longer that a woman's life is the kitchen and child raising. And so you get these women working in factories, and they've sort of been liberated in a strange way. And then, of course, they say, well, why don't we play football as well? Because football's fun, and there's no more people going around saying, oh, women shouldn't be doing that anymore, or there's less of that. And so women start founding their own factory football teams. And the most famous of these is called Dick Kerr Ladies in Preston. And it becomes immensely popular. And it peaks soon after the war. Boxing Day 1920, Dick Kerr Ladies beat St Helens 4-0 in front of 53,000 paying spectators at Everton's sold-out Goodison Park.
That's amazing.
For a women's game in 1920. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
You did not know this?
I didn't know any of this at all.
It's an amazing story. So women's football, the first time it really appears as a biggish thing, people are like, yeah, great. Yeah, where can I buy tickets? And loads of women want to play. And it's a threat to men's football.
And this is why it ultimately will be a flash in the pan.
Yeah, because the Football Association male run is terrified. They think, hang on, women's football could actually threaten the men's game, become a rival to us, maybe bigger. And so the war at this point is over and women are being returned to the kitchen. And in 1921, the FA forbids its member clubs from letting women play on their fields. So pretty much every club in England is associated to the Football Association. You are told you cannot let females play on your fields. So if you're a girl or a woman who wants to play, you can go and kick a ball in the park and then be mocked, etc. You cannot play on a proper field. There'll be no changing rooms, nothing. And
it also prevents, obviously, the institutionalization of women's teams and clubs.
And the commercialization, which was happening very successfully. And this isn't just an English thing. I mean, football federations in all the leading countries, from Spain to Canada to Germany, adopt the ban on women's football or at least you're not allowed to use the Football Federation facilities, which is almost every proper football facility in the whole country. And this ban lasts in most countries until the late 60s or early 70s.
And it's done, all those federations do it for the same reason. They think it's going to threaten the monopoly of the men's game.
I think that's the big underlying reason. And then the spoken reason, which I think is to some degree sincere, is women shouldn't be doing this. This isn't feminine, etc. Which always happens when women want to play sports. So women can't run the marathon because it will damage their reproductive abilities and this kind of stuff. So you get that in every sport.
So there's this incredible counterfactual that if women's football from the 20s onwards was just allowed to flourish, where would we be today? So we basically have a half a century of a murder on women's football.
Well, this is why Stefan Szymanski and I argue in our book Soccernomics that men's football should pay financial reparations to women's football, because you've just nobbled a competitor in a way that now would be completely illegal.
Yeah, anti-competitive.
Yeah, it's complete anti-competitive behaviour. The financial loss to women's football, you can estimate at some level, will be in the billions. And so male football clubs would be obliged to put enormous amounts of money into facilities and promotion of women's football now, which is what they should be doing. And only now in the 2020s, 100 years later, you're seeing women's football grow in the way that it was doing in the 1920s.
Wow.
But the Dick Kerr ladies deserve their own podcast, so I think we should tell that in full another day.
Coming soon.
Back to the front for now. After 1915, the only footballs you see in British-German encounters emerge during actual battles, because the idea that war is a kind of footer match, and that it's all a jolly thing, took a while to die completely among the more idiotic public school men in particular. So at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, there are some British officers who lead their men over the top into the German machine gun fire by kicking rugby balls or footballs into no man's land and then starting to chase after them.
That's horrific.
It is like something out of the play, but it did actually happen. Yeah. So there's this chap called Captain W.P. Neville of the 8th East Surrey. He kicks a ball into no man's land on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, runs after it towards the German lines until he takes a bullet in his head. Wow. Now, that first day of the Battle of the Somme was probably the worst day in British history. And in all, 1.2 million men were killed or wounded at the Somme. And all over Britain for a few days, messenger boys would be seen cycling up country lanes, carrying dreadful telegrams to deliver them to mothers and fathers at home.
So we've established that the Christmas Truce happened, and it was a series of spontaneous, organic football matches, or just kick around, mainly between British and German soldiers, that were taking place all over different parts of the Western Front. And despite attempts to sort of discredit it and say this was fake news, we have enough empirical evidence to say that it was real.
Yes, and I would refer again to the books that we use as sources, especially Stanley Weintraub and Michael Jörgs.
Join us after the break, where we'll talk about the aftermath of the truce, its wider significance now looking back at the conflict. Could there have been an alternative version of World War I? And also, why is it so difficult to imagine something like this breaking out in the conflicts we see today?
Join us after the break. This is a reminder that you're listening to Heroes and Humans of Football with me, Simon Cooper.
And me, Mehreen Khan. Welcome back to Heroes and Humans. Are you loving listening to Heroes and Humans every week? Do you hate the wait between our weekly episodes? If so, why not join our official H&H Supporters Club on Patreon? This exclusive community is the place for behind-the-scenes, sneak peeks, Q&A opportunities with me and Simon, and more bonus content. The link is in the episode description and on all our social media bios. Humans, you join us just after the end of the Great War in 1918. And Simon, people are slowly beginning to discover through these correspondences that are emerging that this truce took place in what was then the most bloody conflict in modern history. So after millions dead, does the truce change people's perceptions about this war?
Well, there were always people who understood the truce had happened, that there had been these football matches and fraternization between Germans and Britons. And after the war, after knowing the terrible slaughter, and after seeing that it was largely pointless, I mean, what had World War I been about? Historians are still trying to understand. They looked at the truce as a kind of potential alternative history, which is that the war ends that day, that the troops say, bugger this, why are we killing each other? Let's just be friends. And that spreads, and then there's a kind of spontaneous peace that emerges, and everybody goes back home. And so that's a way that people have always thought about the Christmas Truce, those who understood that it had happened. So Sherlock Holmes's creator, Arthur Conan Doyle, who lost a son in the Great War, he described the truce in his book about 1914 as, quote, one human episode amid all the atrocities. And that one human episode, it gives us a glimpse of an alternative history of World War I, but then also of the whole century. So imagine a century in which, starting at Christmas 1914, everyone stops shooting and starts playing football instead. Then you got no Battle of the Somme, maybe no Russian Revolution in 1917. There's no resentments about World War I to fuel World War II. So you have no Stalingrad, Auschwitz, or Gulag Archipelago in this alternative history where the war ends in 1914, everybody goes back. We've lost 1 million men. It's a tragedy that we'll remember forever. And now we're going to build our societies and build roads and bring people clean water and vaccinations and that. And Stanley Weintraub writes, and this is very well put, he says, Christmas 1914 suggests an unrealized potential to burst its seams and rewrite a century. And, you know, this may sound unrealistic fantasy, and it is, but the footballers of that day would have wanted it. I mean, how many of those guys who were kicking balls together at Christmas 1914 lived to see Christmas 1918? The British soldier William Dawkins, who witnessed Christmas football in 1915, he later said of his commanding officers, I quote, had just one of these big mouths gathered together 10,000 footballs, what a happy solution that would have been without bloodshed. And one of the most influential books of my childhood was All Quiet on the Western Front. It's this lightly fictionalized memoir of his war by Erich Maria Remarque, the great German writer. And at one point, the soldiers are sitting around in the trench and saying, what should we do instead of war? Why don't we have a fight between the top generals and politicians on both sides? So we'd send them into this kind of boxing arena and they could tear each other to bits. And then whoever won had won the war. And then we wouldn't have to be shot to pieces.
And it's also really not that fanciful, this idea that peace could have broken out, because that was precisely the fear of the generals. That's why they had to stop it.
Yeah, and also why they had to motivate the working classes on both sides into this war that a lot of working class people, especially, of course, some middle class people too, couldn't see the point of.
And I guess with the long sweep of, benefit of hindsight and the long sweep of 20th century history, we then begin to realize the power of the masses and the collective action of working classes to then win rights, voting rights, political representation, all the things that were being consciously held back. It becomes much more laden with significance once we know what happened afterwards.
Well, and Marxists in August 1914 were saying to the working classes, you should have class solidarity, not go and fight each other, which the Marxist solution in this case was totally correct. And you didn't have a war because Germans hated Britons or because Britons hated Germans. You had a war because both states had calculated wrongly that going to war was in their interests. And so that's why this war goes on in Christmas 1914. It's got nothing to do with what the men at the front want. It's what people in Berlin and London are deciding.
More than 100 years on, we're talking about this episode. I imagine lots of our listeners maybe have never even heard of it, even if they went to British state school like me. But where are we now when it comes to the historical memory of World War I, but also this very, very peculiar episode?
Well, I think it's still taught to the kids today, just as it was to you. But I do think that World War I is fading into history. You see, when I was a kid, old men had fought in World War I. In the 1970s, there were loads of them about. But it's now becoming ancient history, like the American Civil War. I realized this when I was researching the Christmas Truce story nearly 20 years ago. I went to Ypres, the Belgian town that was virtually destroyed in the war. It's a town where so many British soldiers died, and I think Winston Churchill wanted to buy the town as a monument for Britain. And the town's main industry is now World War I. So you go to Ypres, and even on a rainy day, it's full of British tourists, staying in hotels with names like the Shell Hole. And they go and they visit their great-grandfather's graves. They tour the In Flanders Fields Museum in the old cloth halls. And I went around the museum, and there was an exhibit there on the Christmas Truce. But you just can't really imagine the trenches. It just seems another universe. And I didn't think the other visitors could either. You had these bored school children the day I was there. You had these 3 English ladies discussing where they would have lunch after the museum. And you have this grainy footage of the war playing behind you, but it's a very poorly filmed war, of course. And so it's very difficult to bring it to life from our experience. In fact, many people have commented that the closest they've come to seeing World War I is the Russian-Ukrainian war, which very often, with its trenches and puddles and people shooting at each other, men freezing in the steppes, looks like the Western Front of World War One. The other thing is that the reason it was very hard for us to feel it is that today in Western Europe, the dream of Christmas 1914 has actually come true. We stopped war. We threw away our weapons for 80 years. England and Germany only meet in football matches. Even the very stupid football is war analogy is largely disappearing, I would say, from
Pretty
those
much.
matches.
Pretty much. I think in the 2020s we can say that.
I mean, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s reading shoot and match magazines, they would be full of these metaphors about battles, ammunition, Liverpool brought up the artillery, this kind of nonsense. Before the England-Germany match at Euro 96, which I think was the last kind of flourish of this nonsense in the tabloids, the Daily Mirror front page showed 2 England players in Second World War helmets with the headline Achtung Surrender, and the Sun's headline was Blitz Fritz. And I think the last paper in Europe that I'm aware of that did that was one Polish newspaper at Euro 2008 before Poland-Germany. They used Second World War imagery. And at that point, everyone, players, coaches, other media said, shut up.
Yeah, it's not appropriate.
Yeah, so that's died out. So we haven't had war in Western Europe since 1945, and we have also ditched the warlike language in football, although there are a few England fans who you'll still hear chanting 2 World Wars and 1 World Cup.
Yeah.
Not you. No. Mehreen, the question I want to ask you, and I'm sure your views on this are totally different from mine, as on any other subject, is why is a Christmas truce like in 1914 unthinkable in today's wars in Ukraine or Sudan or Gaza, nor would we have an Eid or Hanukkah truce match there either? Why not? What's the difference? Now, the difference is not that there's been enormous and horrendous slaughter, because there was enormous and horrendous slaughter in World War One as well. About 2 million soldiers killed on the Western Front and over 500,000 civilians, way more killed on the Eastern Front, by the way. So World War One, it couldn't have got more horrible, and yet they play this Christmas match. Why can we not imagine that in today's wars?
Well, I guess we've partly explained it, right? So in doing this episode, we are talking about something that was anomalous, that was odd. It was never replicated in the other years of that Great War. So we've answered the question that these things don't happen, which is why they're not happening today. And there's also this element about, I think, the beginning of World War One being very much a 19th century war, right? A war.
They thought it was going to be a 19th century war of kind of you ride up on horseback and you're valorous.
But you have intimacy with your enemy. You can see the whites of their eyes. You hear them have breakfast every morning. You hear them sing their songs. There's some sense of familiarity. They share a religious tradition. Some Protestants, Catholics, but ultimately they have a religious day.
Yeah, although that's largely true of Russians and Ukrainians as well.
It is true. And I think that is the exception. So I think we should probably differentiate when we talk about, which kind of conflicts are going on today. And I think when Russia-Ukraine happened and you heard reports of young Russian soldiers landing in Ukraine, killing people that looked and sounded a lot like them, it was a shock to their system, because that was kind of a throwback to a 19th century kind of war. And I think in this war, the one we're talking about, the Great War, later on you see it developing into a more of a 20th century war. So you have the use of chemical warfare. You have gassing of trenches. You have a more mechanized form of killing that happens in this war later on. And then in the Second World War, then we get to a more 20th century kind of war, a technological war, a war where you bomb cities, a war where you invade through sea as much as you do land.
And in a 21st century war, you may never physically see the person that you have killed.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to remember that the what we call wars today are not really being fought by 2 equivalent powers or armies or even forces. I don't describe Israel-Gaza as a war, right? Unless the soldiers you're fighting are children.
Yeah,
right? If you think about the highest number of casualties per the demographic of Palestinians is children under the age of 9 that have died. Similarly in Sudan, these are insurgencies battling over failed nations to take power. They're militants to some degree. They have armies, but those armies are made up of recruits and mercenaries and people who happen to find themselves in those places rather than fighting for a nation or with a flag.
And civilians are being killed all the time, whereas on the Western Front, there are almost no civilians present.
Exactly. Which, given everything we've said, just shines, I think, more of a spotlight on this moment that we've talked about, the Christmas Truce.
Yeah, it's one of the best moments of the century.
Because it happened at the worst of times.
It happened at the worst of times, and the if only attached is so beautiful. If only there'd been a mass war strike at the front, which there was in a couple of sectors, and soldiers just lay down their arms and refused to go on. And there's a version of this in the French army mutinies of 1917, spring 1917, where they say we're not going to follow these insane orders to get ourselves slaughtered, climbing up a hill to be mown down by Germans again. So you can imagine quite easily large-scale mutinies of troops on both sides saying, look, the people on the other side are good blokes. I'm just not going to shoot them anymore. And what are you going to kill, 100,000 of us as deserters?
In one of the accounts you described, there's no goalpost, there's no referee. But if there was a referee and they blew the whistle, maybe that would be the moment where they would decide that, yeah, it's time to stop.
Imagine all the people living for today. But I mean, you can imagine all the people living for today. And it's also this hinge moment in history, because if World War I is curtailed and there's no Russian Revolution in 1917, there's no World War II, partly as a reaction to World War I, you could have this incredible Europe. All of Europe would be like Switzerland, essentially.
Better
more
food.
More fun and better food, yeah.
And, not to get too soppy about it, but...
Get soppy.
Well, we do a football podcast and we have different other guises in our lives. And I think we think this is, perhaps the lowest stake, most frivolous of the activities that we do as journalists. We're just talking about this game. But as you said, in these hinge moments of history, football does something else. It shows us about its potential when it comes to bonding, human kinship, an alternative future, somewhere where, the stakes are less high, you're tribal and you have the other side, but ultimately you're in it together. And I think that's what makes this one of the most beautiful moments in all of football's history.
Yeah, and football kind of justifies everything else. Football redeems us for all the bad stuff that we spend most of our time doing.
A very, very Christian sentiment from you, fittingly. Neither of us are Christian.
Happy Christmas to everyone who is, and happy holidays to those who are not.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Heroes and Humans of Football. For more information, go to our website at heroesandhumans.com.
And follow us at Heroes and Humans on all social platforms. This show was developed by Immaterial and produced by One Fine Play. Matt Cheney is the series producer. Kazra Firuzia is the editor and producer. We have been your hosts, Mehreen Khan
and Simon Cooper.
And this has been Heroes and Humans of Football.